Hello, and welcome to the Qwoted Interview Series, where we get to the bottom of what's top of mind with rock stars in the media landscape, the journalists, columnists, thought leaders, owner executives. I'm your host, Lou Carlozo, the editor in chief of Qwoted, coming to you from the beautiful Qwoted in Chicago. And on today's show, we have an international reporting standout, Sam Kimball. Sam is a journalist, communications specialist, and media maker hailing from upstate New York and currently based in New York City, where he is an adjunct journalism professor at Brooklyn College. Since 2011, he has reported in and on countries around the Middle East and North Africa, from Yemen to Tunisia to Iraq and beyond. As a reporter, writer, communications consultant, and social researcher, Sam has worked for a variety of clients and news organizations that include UNICEF, World Food Program, Vice News, Cornell University, The Intercept, The Guardian, Time, AP, and more. Wow. And he is actually, as we speak, coming to us from Fayetteville, West Virginia, where he is working on a book about the ongoing impact of the Arab Spring revolutions, courtesy of a creative residency. Sam, welcome to the Qwoted Interview Series.
Thank you very much for having me. Glad to be with you.
Yeah. And so as we get into it, I would love to know a bit about how you got involved in journalism and consulting in that part of the world, which stereotypically to the casual observer is dangerous, is remote, is fraught with risk, and perhaps even thankless as a beat, as an area for a journalist to cover. And yet you've done it exceedingly well. What drew you there, and what can you tell us about what it's like to cover that area of the world?
Great, excellent question. In fact, I mean, it touches on some of the themes or the ideas that I try to get at in my journalistic work around, kind of breaking through stereotypes and kind of breaking through misunderstanding of the Middle East, North Africa region. I think, yeah, it was back in, it was in my, let's see, it was after my sophomore year of college that my dad said, well, you like to write, you like to travel, you like to educate people on things, you should be a journalist. And I kind of latched onto that for several years and kept saying to everybody, yeah, one day I'm going to be a journalist. Don't worry, I'm going to do this. I didn't know quite how to start out. And at that time, I was studying Arabic language at the City College of New York. And yeah, so I was kind of, it's a question of the chicken or the egg. I ended up just studying the language because I liked languages and I wanted to learn that. It seemed a very important and in language at the time. That was back in 2006 or seven. And then once I got this idea of being a journalist, a reporter on the ground, I thought, okay, well, if I'm, making progress in this language, maybe it's sensible for me to report in the Middle East. And so yeah, then after college, I ended up moving to Syria to study Arabic
Wow.
at the University of Damascus, which was a very popular program at the time for students from around the world. Um, and then um, and then the Arab Spring revolutions broke out first in Tunisia and then Egypt, and then spread to many other countries in the region. And so these mass protests and revolutionary, street movements began while I was there in 2011 as an Arabic student and also teaching English at a language center. And that's when I published my first piece. But it was not at all about the movements happening all around me in the country. Instead, it was for a local English language magazine about the Syrian jazz scene. Uh, and so anyway, then and then I went back to New York and I started a semester in graduate school, an interdisciplinary studies program, and then I took a leave of absence because the Arab Spring revolutions were kind of unfolding across the Arabic speaking world, and I felt I had a duty to go there and kind of try and cover this historic moment. And so I took a leave of absence and I moved to Yemen because it was one of the countries that seemed to be least covered. There were a lot of journalists in Tahrir Square in Cairo. There were a bunch of them in Tunisia. More and more were going to places like Syria, but very few, it seemed, were reporting in or from Yemen. So I moved there for about 6 months, and that's where I got my start, kind of reporting on politics and humanitarian issues going on in that region. And I'll just say briefly about this kind of this idea of like danger and like kind of breaking through some of that fear. I would just say that fear, yeah, absolutely. There are places in the Arabic speaking kind of region of Middle East and North Africa that where there's armed conflict. There have been places where there are wars, and some of those are going on now as we speak. Um, but often the media discourse, which then sort of filters down to kind of popular thinking and popular discourse, the conversations you have with your friends on the street corner, is one of often of extremely simplistic narratives around ideas around Islamic terrorism. Or extremism or dictators. And while some of these things may exist in certain particular places at particular times, I mean, it's by no means at all the dominant situation for a lot of these countries, and so that's why I think it's so incredibly important for journalists to go into these countries, being extremely respectful of the people they meet, and of course the journalists who are from those countries, who are often reporting better than they are. You know, some parachute journalists from the United States or Britain or somewhere in Europe, and really try and get under the sort of the headlines about this or that terrorist group or this or that dictator, but actually look at the structural questions of why is it that there's violence in this particular spot? Or why is it that there's a history of underdevelopment or poverty in this particular spot? What are the structural reasons? And that's something that I find most journalists are not trained to do or don't even think to do. Um, or in some cases are not interested in doing, and that's something that I'm just trying a little bit to begin to do, to explain how things like imperialism or capitalism or inequality or more and more environmental destruction due to climate change play a role in creating conflict or creating inequality or a lack of democracy in some places at some specific times.
Yeah, that is fabulous. A very comprehensive view. Great answer to the question. And you touched on the Arab Spring a couple of times, right? And I think a journalism person, one of the greatest privileges is to be able to write that first draft of history, to borrow from an expression about what it is that we do. You were there for the Arab Spring. You've got a book you're working on that's tentatively titled What Are We Waiting For? Revolution, Counter Revolution, and the Arab Spring through the eyes of those who lived it. You lived through it. Tell us a little bit about the book and what it was like to witness various aspects of the Arab Spring.
Well, so it's funny because in that 2011 period, when these revolutions were breaking out across cities and villages and towns across the Arabic-speaking region and beyond. I mean, we have to remember that this, what is now called the Arab Spring, ended up inspiring revolutionary movements and uprisings and protests throughout various parts of the world, including Europe and the United States, with Occupy Wall Street and Podemos in Spain and otherwise. But I that 2011 moment, I have always kind of had regret that I kind of missed a lot of it, in the sense that I was in Syria. Syria became a linchpin of the Arab Spring revolutions, and then tragically of the counter revolution, which was so bloody. But I was there as as an Arabic language student, and I was in the middle of that. But only a month or two into the protests, said, "Okay, I'm going home." I just didn't really know what to do, how to start. Um, and I would email other journalists and say, "Okay, I'm here. Like, what do I do?" They'd say, "Just go out in the street and start talking to people and write it down, and then write up an article." I had no idea how to start, so in that kind of paralysis, I ended up leaving the country. Not before, though, spending a couple of weeks in Tunisia, where I hoped to get my big start as some star journalist, where I ended up publishing, I suppose, my first piece of political reporting on a blog. But anyway, but then coming back to Yemen, moving there in 2012, when already so much had happened there, a president had been overthrown. There was a new transitional process to install a new government that would supposedly be more accountable to the people and more just. Um, yeah, I always had this feeling that I had kind of missed the moment, not realizing that this was a process of change that would go on for years. And as we're seeing now, 15 years later, decades actually. I think that, just to answer that briefly, I think that seeing the results and the ongoing process of the Arab Spring in a place like Yemen, which was the first of these countries that had gone to as a journalist. I think that it was far more messy than I had thought it would be. I thought it would just be a bunch of protests in a town square demanding one particular thing, and that was it. And indeed, I did see some massive protests, but I also saw, elections, one-man elections for a president. I also went to places where there were uh, where Al Qaeda had recently been controlling and had withdrawn, and people seemed to support Al Qaeda because they brought justice, but others were, disgusted by their level of repression. And speaking to activists who had certain demands that were far from met. So, yeah, I suppose the kind of moral of that story is that the what was happening behind these kind of very simple headlines of revolution and democracy was quite complex, and often I found journalism did not, or most journalists, including myself at the time, I'm sure, did not adequately address that complexity. And indeed, the journalism business often wants to simplify things, and that's the struggle that we face as journalists. About the book, I'm actually just in the proposal writing phase of it. But the idea is to look at the sort of the history going back, 100 years or so behind the Arab Spring, the economy, the colonization, various social differences, and look at three case studies: Tunisia, Libya, and Yemen, and the story of one revolutionary in each of these countries, some of whom are now living in exile, and tell the story of that country's revolution and what's happened since. And then, perhaps most importantly, the lessons that activists and radicals and revolutionaries across the world can learn, both the pitfalls as well as the things to be imitated from these various revolutionary movements across these countries.
Love it. I mean, you're talking about going from an area of deep roots and historical precedent to what the lessons learned are. And as a journalist along the way, I love how you mentioned your beginnings. Like, what do I do? Well, go out and talk to people. What was your learning curve like as you walked through that part of the world and entering into a new profession? What were some of the things that you picked up on that really helped you to get from that place of wannabe to like, hey, I'm doing this, I'm in the thick of it?
Yeah, wannabe is a great word actually, because for years, actually, I didn't really feel comfortable calling myself a journalist because I felt it was one of those holy titles someone might have, like calling themselves a poet or a novelist or something, that there was some kind of criteria or credential you had to reach that was unspoken.
I love it.
A quote journalist, or in the more artistic cases, a poet or a writer, right? That these were sort of sanctified holy words. And that stuck with me for a long time. And so I did kind of feel like I was a wannabe. But I'll say on a practical level that when I was in Syria in 2011 and I did that first piece of published writing, which I said was about the burgeoning jazz scene in Syria, what was quickly becoming revolutionary Syria. Actually, it was easier for me to do that because I had a friend who was a sort of chef, writer, part-time journalist, Arabic language aficionado, a British guy who had started the piece. He already had the commission with the local magazine, and he had done an interview or two. So he had some notes. He gave me those notes. He said, "You know what? I can't finish this. Why don't you take it on? I'll tell the editor." So I knew who were the musicians I should go speak to. I already had some pointers from him for how to write it. The magazine was a little bit more forgiving in terms of style and format, so I didn't have to write to these very rigid formats. Um, and I had the time to write something lengthy and colorful, which is kind of easy for me. The kind of punchy, real short, very strict news stories that actually have always been the most challenging. And then once I went to Yemen in 2012 and said, I'm going to be a journalist, um, I remember the first piece that I wrote, likewise, actually, it was a collaborative thing where I was working with an American who was my roommate who had some experience as a journalist. And we decided to work on a story for IRIN, the UN Humanitarian News Service, what is now the New Humanitarian, um, about refugees in the south of Yemen, or IDPs in the south of Yemen. And we were going to work on it together, except the part that I would do would be down there in the south of Yemen. So I took a bus. I went down. It was like a 12-hour bus ride to get down there. I met some people at like a police station and said, "Hey, where are the IDPs?" They said they're over sheltering in this school. I went and spoke to a bunch of them, brought back all these notes and recordings. Didn't quite know what to do with it, but once I got back to the capital of Sana'a, where my colleague and roommate was working on his part of the story, I said, "Okay, I have all this stuff from these first person meetings of people in the schoolhouse, these IDPs who have been pushed out because of fighting from this particular area. What do I do with it?" And then he was able to give me some pointers of, okay, we can structure it like this. We'll put the quotes here. I'll put an intro, etc. And so it was by kind of giving me kind of like a lift up, like something I could step on to move up and say, oh, okay, that's how you structure it. That's what a nut graph is. This is how you format a quote. That learning from others who had a little bit more experience from me than me, and also just going and getting the raw material from people who were living the experience of displacement that we were writing about. Those were the kind of really important ingredients that allowed me to get just a little bit of confidence to then start doing some articles on my own.
Absolutely. I love how you mention that notion of standing on the shoulders of giants. I want to send a shout out to David Lee Preston, who in my cub reporter days at the Philadelphia Inquirer really gave me a sense of here's how you do a humorous touch. He also encouraged me a lot in my work. And there is that almost artificial discrepancy, right? Between, okay, someday I will get to call myself a journalist, which is a royal title, as we all know, only bestowed by Woodward and Bernstein and nobody else, versus you just jump in and before you know it, you're doing it. You are producing journalism. In post, I'm going to actually edit in a picture. This is me in 1989 as a long haired rocker with no journalism experience. And when I jumped into a newsroom, I had imposter syndrome, I want to say, for the whole first year. And at one point, I think it was about 2 weeks in, and the editor said, okay, well, this is a good start, but go back and fix the nut graph. And I
Uh,
walked back to my desk and I'm like, what the frig is a nut graph? And I was scared to ask anybody. I thought I was going to be outed. I just tinkered with the story, gave it back to him, prayed he wasn't going to come down on me. He said, yeah, that's much better. So I think it was 6 months before I finally had the courage to ask someone what a nut graph was. But boy, oh boy, really drawing on a lot of inspiration here from hearing how you did it. And I think touching on the central truth that what we do is storytelling, right? And anybody can tell a story. And we've been told stories from the earliest parts of our lives, right? So to think of it in that term really makes it, I think, a lot less intimidating. Okay, I'm going to tell a story. I saw something today. I talked to some people. Here's how I structure it. Oh, I've got this friend here who can help me out in terms of placing the quotes here and the lead in here. And suddenly it's down and dirty right into the craft of it.
yeah, and I think first you gave a shout out to the Philadelphia Inquirer, which is speak about the shoulder of giants, right? I mean that's a paper of record in the United States. I should also mention to give credit where it's due that when I got to Yemen, I just got there, got off the plane. I got my visa as an Arabic language student. That was the only way I could get into the country. But once I got there, aside from taking some Arabic lessons, there was nothing else for me to do. And someone said, you should try and talk to the editor at the Yemen Times, which was an English language newspaper there in Sana'a, and see if they'll give you a job. And that was the case with numerous English language and not even first language English first language journalists who came from various countries. They would often get their start there as editors, copy editors, sometimes reporters. And so I was what was called a creative editor down there at the Yemen Times for about 4 or 5 months, and worked alongside some really stellar beginner Yemeni journalists who I was kind of learning alongside and trying to coach, and they were coaching me. So that was a really formative experience that I had there, and my first experience in a newsroom. And on the note of a newsroom, I think there's a generational difference here, where you got your start in a traditional newspaper newsroom, but by the time I was getting my start, newspapers and traditional media was really beginning to fall into decline. To get such a job as the one you described as a beginner like myself would be, immensely difficult. And it wasn't until years later that I did finally work in a traditional newsroom, so to speak. But that the work that I was doing was right off the bat freelance. And when I learned about a nut graph, that was through a much, much more experienced reporter, an American who I had met in Yemen. And months later, I was sending her my pitches because she was my mentor and saying, hey, what do you think of this pitch? Some pitch I wrote in Egypt. And she would come back and say, oh, that's good, but you buried the nut graph. You should have the nut. So I was learning these terms and these kind of this journalistic jargon, as well as some of the traditional formats, in a purely freelance capacity, while sitting in a mall cafeteria using the Wi-Fi to email my pitch to someone who was thousands of miles away, who was saying, this is what a nut graph is. So to me, it demonstrates like a real change in the media and journalism business between what you experience, you said in the 80s, and what I was experiencing in like 2013.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And you also touch on a point here that I think is very crucial for people to understand, is that the business has changed so much. Newsrooms, by and large, don't exist anymore. Even where they do exist, it's very decentralized. People working at home, people working out in the field. And of course, with all of the changes in content in general, people who are trying to jockey around in this field may send out hundreds of resumes and not feel that they're having any luck. One thing that you have talked about and that I have learned as well is the value of having a connection within the organization. What would you stress about that to people watching this video, especially some of the current day newbies, the wannabes that want to get in?
Yeah. I mean, that's also really a key question. I mean, as is often the case in many fields, though it appears to me that in journalism and then also related communications fields, I have also done work as a communications consultant with various NGOs and the UN, that there is a lot of job or interview via having a connection inside the organization, someone who can vouch for you, say this person's smart, they're a hard worker, they're worth, they produce good work, they're really worth speaking to. I really wish that that was not the case, that there were many more jobs available, that, that everybody was given a real fair look over their resume, their CV, given a chance to interview. And that to me, as someone who was in 2024 and 25 applying madly for journalism jobs as well as communication jobs and hearing nothing back despite my 13, 14 years of experience. Yeah, it's really unfortunate that that's the case, that often one does need someone who is already working with the organization, whether that's NPR or the Philadelphia Inquirer or this or that comms agency, to tap the shoulder of the HR person to say, "Oh, hey, Sally or Joe submitted their resume and cover letter. Just make sure you have a close look because it's worth looking at." So that's often very, very valuable for people looking to break into the industry, and even for people who have been in journalism and or communications for many years, such as myself.
Yeah. And very quickly, as we wrap up, definitely want to give a plug for the Unheard Iraq podcast. Tell us a little bit about it and how people can tune in to listen to it.
So in 2017, I took part in something called the Transom Storytelling Workshop out in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, which was basically a 2 month long residential workshop where some of these masters in audio storytelling and journalism taught us, me and a cohort of other workshoppers, how to do audio storytelling, and that could be about, bird watching in the fields of Nantucket. Um, or it could be, more kind of concrete audio journalism. And they were teaching about that. So radio reporting and radio storytelling. And after I completed that workshop, I thought, okay, well, I've really got to pass these skills on to someone to make it worth it. I raised some money through a Kickstarter, and I ended up going back to Iraq, where I had been in 2017, and gave a 5 day training along with some Iraqi radio journalists and journalism trainers, a 5 day training in radio storytelling. And then some of these young upstart journalists and media makers went out into their neighborhoods in Mosul in Iraq, where, just months earlier there had been a gigantic war against ISIS. And they collected these really beautiful, intimate stories from people they knew in their neighborhoods, whether that was a pair of baker brothers or a university professor or a young poet or a painter. And so ever since then, we've been working together, me and a team in Egypt, Tunisia, the US, as well as the young journalists back in Iraq, to create a series of podcast episodes based around each one of these individual neighborhood stories from Mosul, but imbued with context from Iraqi scholars about the politics and the economy and the history of Iraq, in order to go back to what we started on, dispel these myths and stereotypes about Iraq as some inherently violent place, and instead explain the place through the narratives of these ordinary people in Mosul. And so we've created one full episode so far, which is up on the Unheard Iraq website, and I'll share that link with you so you can share with viewers. And we're in the process of developing further episodes based on these stories from Mosul, and looking for partners that we can work with to broadcast them and get them out to the wider world.
That is fantastic. And there really is a need to get those stories out. That's the quickest way to dispel inaccurate stereotypes and also to give voice to people who maybe haven't had it before. So, Sam, incredible work, incredible rich history. Look forward to the book when it's ready and comes out. And thank you so much for being on the Quoted Interview Series.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Sam Kimball is a journalist, communications specialist, and media maker hailing from upstate New York. You can find him everywhere on the internet. Just enter the byline Sam Kimball, Kimball. Thanks for tuning in to the Quoted Interview Series. Our producer in Chicago is Ken Montone. A special thanks to the co-founders of Quoted, Matt Neller and Dan Simon. Don't forget that Quoted is the world's #1 platform for bringing journalists, PR, and subject matter experts together, not just in the service of the story, but also in the spirit of building community and connections. I'm Lou Carlozo, your host. Remember to check out my financial services podcast, Bankadelic, which you can hear via Apple Podcasts and SoundCloud. Until next time, stay tuned, stay true, and stay suddenly connected.